malkeinu, chonenu v'anenu, ki ein banu ma'asim, aseh imanu tzedakah v'chesed, v'hoshienu. Avinu malkeinu, almighty and merciful, answer us with grace, for our deeds are wanting. Save us through acts of justice and love.
Please be seated, everyone. Shana Tova. Earlier this year, on Saturday, February 16th, Shabbat Titzaveh, one of the titans of social justice in our reform movement passed away at the ripe old age of 95. If not Moses' 120 years, it seemed close enough. Al Vorspan wasn't simply a Jewish social justice advocate. He was, at least for us reform rabbis, I'm pleased to acknowledge my mentor, Rabbi Maynard Bell, and his wife, Jean Schulman, who are joining us. He was, for us reform rabbis, the advocate of Jewish social justice, the advocate, a veritable titan of Tikkun Olam. That's a good one. I like that. Maybe we'll trademark that. A veritable titan of Tikkun Olam before we had even adopted that term back in the day, when we still used the common English jargon of social action and social justice to describe our movement's commitment to civil rights, to women's rights, to the war on poverty, and opposition to the war in Vietnam. Most of my generation, raised in Reform synagogues, grew up reading Al Vorspan's textbooks as kids. Justice and Judaism, Searching the Prophets for Values, was one such text. The other, To Do Justly, a junior casebook for social action intended for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. From Al Vorspan, we learned that it wasn't enough to learn or to speak of Jewish values. One had to act on those values and live them to be a Reform Jew. For my generation, Al Vorspan and the rabbinic leadership of Reform Judaism, Al was not a rabbi. Rabbis Alexander Schindler, Balfour, Brickner, Eugene Borowitz, Eugene Lippman, and Michael Robinson, Alehem HaShalom, reminded us that we were part of the prophetic movement in Judaism. Vorspan and the others didn't create the Reform movement's identification with the prophets of Hebrew Scripture. In fact, if anyone had done that, it had been the founder of Reform Judaism itself in Germany, Rabbi Abraham Geiger. Born of the early 19th century European emancipation and then Enlightenment, particularly in Germany, our earliest Reform principles were formulated by Rabbi Geiger and his associates. The 3 central principles of Geiger and the early reformers were, there won't be a test, 1, the notion of an ongoing progressive revelation of God's will beyond the Torah. 2, utilization of a historical critical approach to sacred texts and traditions. And 3, this is the one you need to remember, the centrality of the Hebrew prophets. In fact, as early as 1838, Geiger had named his ideology, in German, prophetic Judaism. He understood morality and ethics to be the stable core of Judaism. while ritual observance he felt developed and transformed as needed throughout the ages. Almost a century later, on the same continent, a very young Abraham Joshua Heschel would pursue a study of those same Hebrew prophets for his PhD dissertation at the University of Berlin, publishing it in 1936 at the tender age of 19. That same year, the Reformed Rabbinate of America gathered in Columbus, Ohio, and offered a reformulation of its 1885 Pittsburgh platform. It's perhaps best known for welcoming Zionism into the Reform movement, but it also spoke prophetically to the American social issues of the day. To quote, "Justice to all, irrespective of race, sect, or class, is the inalienable right and the inescapable obligation of all. The state and organized government exists in order to further these ends. Judaism seeks the attainment of a just society by the application of its teachings to the economic order, to industry and commerce, and to national and international affairs. Judaism aims at the elimination of man-made misery and suffering, of poverty and degradation, of tyranny and slavery, of social inequality and prejudice, of ill will and strife. Judaism advocates the promotion of harmonious relations between warring classes on the basis of equity and justice, and the creation of conditions under which human beings may flourish. It champions the cause of all who work and of their right to an adequate standard of living as prior to the rights of property. Judaism emphasizes the duty of charity and strives for a social order which will protect men and women against the material disabilities of old age, sickness, and unemployment." 1936. Barely 2 years later, in 1938, Heschel was, to quote his own biography, "plucked like a brand from the fire," rescued 6 weeks before from the impending Nazi invasion of Poland by that same Reform rabbinate that I just quoted. HUC President Rabbi Julian Morgenstern provided Heschel with a visa out of Warsaw and confirmed his employment as a faculty member at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, for those of you who didn't know. Like the Reform movement of his era, Heschel identified with the compelling call of the ancient prophets of Israel. In his 1962 masterwork, The Prophets, which was built upon that earlier PhD dissertation, Heschel argues for the view of the Hebrew prophets as receivers of what he called divine pathos, of people who experience God's emotional state, God's anger, and God's sorrow over the nation of Israel, which had forsaken both God and the covenant. Prophets do not speak for God, Heschel argued, so much as they remind their human audience of God's voice for the voiceless, the poor, and the oppressed. He wrote, "Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profane riches of the world. Prophecy is a form of living, a crossing point of God and humanity. God rages in the prophet's words." Now, Rabbi Heschel's masterpiece was too advanced for me as a 7th and 8th grade religious student at the Riverdale Temple. But I was introduced to quotations from the work beginning in high school as selections of the book found their way into creative youth group services and my confirmation class. And Heschel's masterpiece certainly wasn't limited to youth groups, houses of worship, or even seminary libraries. Andrew Young, James Lawson, Vincent Harding, C.T. Vivian, Bayard Rustin were among the young leadership in the civil rights movement who, quote, carried a copy of that paperback edition in their back pocket for inspiration and consolation. Though Heschel had in 1946 moved from the Reform Movement's HUC Cincinnati campus to the New York City-based Conservative Jewish Theological Seminary, it was yet again another imperfect pairing. Now, as much as Heschel practiced and respected halachic rabbinic Judaism, it wasn't what inspired him or his teaching. In fact, the singular academic focus on halacha at JTS and beyond troubled him immensely. He wrote, "Those who would restrict Judaism to halacha, Jewish law, will distort its image and deprive it of its grandeur." Heschel paid the price for his disinterest and his perceived disrespect of halacha. More interested in spirituality than in critical text study, he was denied for many years a graduate research assistant, and he was relegated to teach mainly in the education school and the rabbinic program, but not in the premier academic graduate program for which JTS was acclaimed. I suspect Rabbi Heschel saw it coming. In his theological treatise, God in Search of Man, this is what Heschel wrote. Today it's customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. He wrote, "It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, and love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than in the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. Religion is an answer to humanity's ultimate questions," he wrote, "and we need to rediscover the questions to which religion is an answer." Heschel would find both the questions and the answers not at JTS, but in the events of the world around him. By 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had reached out to the leadership of the American rabbinate asking for their support for the nonviolent civil rights struggle. Rabbi Heschel and Reverend King met for the first time in that year, 1963, in Chicago at the Conference on Religion and Race organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Across their religious differences, they recognized in each other kindred spirits speaking of the same God. In fact, it was just before Shabbat, on Friday, March 19th, 1965, 2 days before the Selma March was scheduled to begin, that Rabbi Heschel received a telegram from Reverend King inviting him to join the marchers in Selma. Who here hasn't seen those pictures? Heschel's presence in the front row of marchers was a visual symbol of religious Jewish commitment to civil rights and stirred not only the Jewish religious community, but Jews young and old into direct action, galvanizing the whole spectrum of activists from fundraisers to lawyers. Upon returning home, Heschel wrote the following in his diary: "I felt a sense of the holy in what I was doing. I felt again what I have been thinking for years, that Jewish religious institutions have again missed a great opportunity, namely to interpret a civil rights movement in terms of Judaism. The vast majority of Jews participating actively in it, in the civil rights movement, are totally unaware of what the movement means in terms of the prophetic traditions. In other words, they knew civil rights was important, but they didn't know it was important Jewishly, as Jews. I'd like to think that Rabbi Heschel's participation in the 1965 march in Selma had, at least in part, been inspired by the actions of Al Vorspan and his Reform Movement rabbinic colleagues the previous summer in St. Augustine, Florida. They too had responded to an invitation from Dr. King to participate in the protests against segregation and the Klan in Florida. Al Vorspan, Rabbi Alexander Schindler, Rabbi Balfour Brickner, Rabbi Eugene Lippman, my teacher, Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, and my wife's childhood rabbi, Michael Robinson, among others, were jailed in June of '64 in St. Augustine for assembling in an integrated group as a protest against racial segregation, discrimination, and violence. From that jail, they sent out this, I hope, well-known prophetic message, writing, "We came because we could not stand quietly by our brother's blood. We had done that too many times before. We have been vocal in our exhortation of others, but the idleness of our own hands too often revealed an inner silence. Silence at a time when silence has become the unpardonable sin of our time. We came in the hope that the God of us all would accept our small involvement as partial atonement for the many things we wish we had done before and often. We came," they wrote, "as Jews who remember the millions of faceless people who stood quietly watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoria. We came because we know that second only to silence, the greatest danger to man is loss of faith in humanity's capacity to act. We pray that what we have done may lead us on to further actions and persuade others who still stand hesitantly to take the stand that they know is just." Just a few years later, in April of 1967, if they hadn't already gotten in enough trouble, Rabbi Heschel would introduce Reverend King to an enormous audience here in New York City at Riverside Church at a gathering sponsored by clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. It was an organization that Rabbi Heschel had helped organize. Dr. King had chosen to speak out publicly for the first time against the war in Vietnam, much to the consternation of many civil rights leaders who feared that it would endanger their message and efforts here in the United States. Professor Heschel introduced Dr. King saying, "We are here because our own integrity as human beings is decaying in the agony and merciless killing done in our name. In a free society, some are guilty and all are responsible. Remember that the blood of the innocent cries out forever." Heschel would later declare that, quote, "To speak about God and to remain silent on the Vietnam War is blasphemous. Tonight, I wish to reaffirm the call and mission of Rabbis Geiger and Heschel to urge us to continue to listen for the prophetic voice in Judaism and to proclaim loudly that in responding to that prophetic call, that not only we in the Reform movement, but also all in the progressive wings of the Jewish community, extending from Jewish renewal to Reconstructionism, to the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, to the liberal wings of modern Orthodoxy, we all are engaged in a true, authentic, and living Judaism. Why do I think we need to proclaim that? Because over the course of the last decade, I have noted ongoing criticism of progressive liberal Judaism and of our Reform movement in particular. The claim that our energies and commitments aren't given to real Jewish priorities, but rather to a liberal political agenda dressed up in biblical and rabbinic texts. Claims that we Reform Jews have broadly painted liberal political agenda items with the brush of tikkun olam, and that our insistence on being an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations, is not actually a Jewish value. Isn't all the political and tikkun olam talk an evasion of the actual purpose of synagogues? Asked Professor Jack Wertheimer of JTS not that long ago. In recent years, he wrote, Reform Judaism has issued resolution after resolution in support of left liberal positions across an array of political and social issues. It has opposed the war in Iraq, sharply rebuked the Christian right, and vigorously supported the left-wing stance on gay marriage, affirmative action, and school vouchers. In all of these areas, writes Wertheimer, the Reform movement has aligned itself perfectly with positions adopted by mainstream liberal Protestantism. I wonder if Professor Wertheimer and others with the same critique have forgotten that Rabbi Heschel aligned himself perfectly with the positions adopted by the Protestant Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Could it be that such criticism is a subtle implication that efforts toward interfaith agreement and accord are somehow a sign of Jewish deficiency or illegitimacy? If you want to say it. Don't hint. Elsewhere, Norman Podhoretz, the former editor of Commentary magazine, writes that on every single cultural issue, he must have checked, the Orthodox oppose the politically correct liberal positions taken by most other American Jews precisely because these positions conflict with Jewish law. He does not have a rabbinic degree, by the way. To cite just a few examples, he claims Jewish law permits abortion only to protect the life of the mother. That's not correct. It forbids sex between men, and it prohibits suicide except when the only alternatives are forced conversion or incest, unquote. The upshot, Podhoretz writes, is that in virtually every instance of a clash between Jewish law and contemporary liberalism, it is the liberal creed that prevails for most American Jews, which is to say that for them, liberalism has become more than a political outlook. It has, for all practical purposes, superseded Judaism and become a religion in its own right. Podhoretz, a secular Jew, posits that because orthodoxy appears to be the most conservative and unchanging stream of Jewish religious tradition, it must therefore be the most authentic. It's a common argument and a common set of assumptions, but his premise is mistaken, and his assertion is dead wrong. Judaism isn't limited to a ritualistic set of daily routines. Judaism isn't limited to showing up to pray at the synagogue, but thank you for showing up. Judaism isn't limited solely to the observance of Shabbat. Judaism isn't limited to studying the sacred texts of Torah and Talmud. Judaism isn't limited to the choices of what we eat and wear. Judaism isn't limited to standing out as a Jew when in a crowd. Judaism is also and always the demand that we engage as individuals and as an identifiable Jewish community with the issues of the larger society in which we live. The expectations and guidelines for such engagement go as far back as the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, which demand a just and equitable society for Jew and non-Jew alike. And while the book of Leviticus may focus mostly on the ancient sacrifices, it too centrally demands justice and that we not stand idly by. To claim, as Wertheimer or Podhoretz and others appear to, that the Torah's concern with society at large and social justice can only be achieved by cherry-picking our sacred text, to me at least, demonstrates a dearth of familiarity with the Torah itself. Without doubt, there is much concern in our sacred text with ritual law and observance. And without doubt, if we wish to continue our sacred legacy and commitment, we can, all of us, embrace more worship, more learning, and more Shabbat. But to claim that one of the Torah's major foci, social justice, is not a true concern and commitment is to deny the hundreds of verses scribed on the vellum of every scroll in every synagogue. And once we move beyond the scroll, beyond those 5 books, deeper into Scripture, into the remaining books, into the 8 volumes of the prophets and the 11 volumes of the writings, they focus not on ritual, but on Israel keeping or violating our covenant with God, a covenant repeatedly built upon and calling for justice and equity for all. As diaspora Jews, we are commanded to engage with the larger non-Jewish community and government around us, as is made clear by the prophet Jeremiah, who proclaimed to those exiled in Babylon, "Seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the eternal God in its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper." The notion that our social justice commitments are somehow limited to only other Jews or only within the Jewish community is belied by the earliest layers of rabbinic teaching and legislation, where we read, "In a city where Gentiles and Jews both dwell, the charity collectors provide sustenance to the poor of both. We visit the sick of both. We bury the dead of both. We console the mourners of both. And we protect the property of both Jew and Gentile for the sake of the ways of shalom." Not just peace, but integrity and wholeness. The criticism that tikkun olam can become the sine qua non of liberal Jewish life to the exclusion of other defining Jewish practices is not without at least some merit. But equally accurate is the critique of insularity among some parts of the traditionalist community, which refuse to engage beyond the parapets of their self-imposed ghetto walls. A living Judaism concerns itself with both the interior and exterior world. That is what Rabbi Heschel sought to impart to his students and disciples. A story is related by his daughter Susanna, and it captures this essential lesson. During what I imagine to have been the stolid 1950s, when Heschel was teaching rabbinic students at JTS, the conservative movement's law committee, there's a law committee that decides things in the conservative movement, had just recently debated whether gelatin was kosher. Heschel came into his class of rabbinic students at JTS and asked, "What is your opinion? Is gelatin kosher or not?" No opinion had been rendered yet. The students spent several animated minutes engrossed, debating the halachic issues involved. But Heschel then interrupted, asking, "What is your opinion? Is the atomic bomb kosher or not?" Stunned silence reigned. Here, halacha could have no clear answer. A different source was needed, a prophetic voice. It is that voice that we in the Reform movement call upon, not claiming that we ourselves are prophets, chas v'shalom, but that a living Judaism must include more than ritual, more than maintaining of previous traditions. We must listen for the prophetic voice that reminds us and challenges us to heed God's demand of living ethically and morally, both as Jews and as human beings. A living Judaism must include a commitment to being God's stewards and partners in the world around us. A living Judaism is committed to preserving the earth and not misusing our planet's resources. A living Judaism takes note that the single most iterated mitzvah of the Torah is not to oppress the stranger. A living Judaism is attentive to the most vulnerable and the most disenfranchised among us, the widow and the orphan, women and children, the elderly and disabled, and those who do not conform to society's current standards and definitions. A living Judaism seeks to welcome all people from all backgrounds with the prophet's words, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples." A living Judaism recognizes that every human being is indeed fashioned in the divine image, and that we have no right nor cause to persecute, nor oppress, nor deny those who live or express their image differently than we do, and that no gender is given dominion or preference over any other. A living Judaism recognizes that human love is a reflection of unlimited divine love, and it takes many forms and shapes. That love is always a healing gift to be welcomed and celebrated. A living Judaism is concerned, as were the prophets, with justice, just laws, just measures, just compensation, and the equal application of justice, not just for some, but for all. A living Judaism is concerned with the safety and security of Jews here and everywhere, but it is also concerned with the safety and security of other groups that have known and continue to experience oppression and discrimination, bigotry and racism. Every person should be able to dwell under their proverbial vine and fig, and none should be able to make them afraid. A living Judaism believes in a living wage and a societal commitment to health care and housing and education, not because they are part of the modern liberal agenda, but because they are part of our ancient, ongoing Jewish values and commitments. A living Judaism asks daily, as Rabbi Heschel asked, "What have I done today to alleviate the anguish, to mitigate the evil, to prevent humiliation of another?" As a Reform rabbi, I turn to the prophets of the Bible, who were not unfamiliar with the criticisms leveled against us today. Those who claim that ritual observance is the only authentic and sincere form of Judaism, or at least that it is the only minimally sufficient form. That only in limiting our involvement in the greater world and avoiding the issues of the day do we remain God's treasured and chosen people. But the prophets came to offer an indictment of such thinking. "What have I need of all your sacrifices, says the Eternal? I am sated with burnt offerings, the suet of fatlings and the blood of bulls. I take no pleasure in lambs and goats. That you come to appear before me, who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Bringing oblations is futile, and your incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with iniquity. I cannot abide them. Your new moons and fixed observances fill me with loathing. They have become a burden to me, and I cannot endure them. And when you lift up your hands in prayer, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. For your hands are stained with crime and injustice. Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wronged. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow." And our upcoming fast in 10 days, the prophet proclaims, Is this the fast I desire, a day of afflicting yourselves, bowing your head like a reed, covering yourself with sackcloth and ashes? Do you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Eternal? Is not this the fast that I desire? To break the shackles of injustice and untie the bonds of the bar. I set the downtrodden free, to tear away every yoke, to set the downtrodden free and to tear away every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to house the homeless poor, when you see the naked that you clothe them and never neglect your own flesh? Again and again and again, unheard and ignored, the prophets decry ritual that is absent ethics and morality. They have to go together. For the eternal God has told you, O human, what is good, says the prophet, and what the eternal requires of you. Maybe you remember this inscribed on the doors of the old UAHC building. Only to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk modestly with your God. This year, let us recommit ourselves as Reformed Jews to that prophetic voice that asks us to live our Jewish lives with commitments to both our own interior Jewish life and observance, which frankly needs improving, and our participation in the larger world around us, which is equally Jewish and we have no reason to apologize for. Ken Yehi Ratzon, L'Shana Tova, Tikatev.